Christina. She is a political consultant. She is an expert on Eastern Europe, and she has advised a number of relevant political players in the Eastern European region. So welcome to the podcast, Christina.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So Christina, just starting to talk about Eastern Europe. The reason we're doing this podcast is that a lot of people who view our content, and especially here in India, they reached out to us telling us that they didn't know so much about what's going on in Eastern Europe. So, like overall, if you were to give a picture to a layman as to where the future of Eastern Europe lies, does it lie with EU? It is already, a lot of countries are part of NATO. Or does it lie with a lot of regional cooperation or reintegration with Russia? Or does it lie as a separate bloc in itself?
Good question. Well, to start out, let's define what we mean by Eastern Europe, because there are some Eastern European countries, including former Soviet countries, that are in both the EU and NATO. For example, the Baltic states have, I think, been a model of development for the rest of that region. They kind of seized a window of opportunity right after the collapse of the Soviet Union to accelerate their integration into the European community, into the transatlantic community. And if you look at all the post-Soviet states and all of Eastern Europe, those Baltic states have emerged as the most successful in many ways, the most developed, most transparent and responsive government. I think Ukraine and Georgia, the countries I have the most experience with, and I would extrapolate to much of Eastern Europe, would like to see their countries on that same path of development. Modern European democracies. It's important to emphasize also that Georgia and Ukraine were always, or throughout history, were occupied by Russia and the Soviet Union. They were not necessarily voluntarily integrated with Russia. And so there is a very long history that stretches even before the Bolshevik Revolution of these countries, these nations have always identified as not Russian. They had their own identity and as part of Western civilization as well. So I believe that is where their destiny lies, because that's already how people see themselves. If you go to Ukraine or Georgia and you talk to anyone under the age of 35, so anyone who was raised after the Soviet Union collapsed, they're more likely to speak English than Russian these days as a second language, especially in Georgia. So that shows you where, of course, there's the practical aspect, wanting better jobs or wanting to emigrate even. That's a big, brain drain is unfortunately a big problem there, but also it just shows where their mentality is.
Right. And so, you're talking about the destiny of Eastern Europe and what countries think that they, what people think about their own identities, which actually draws me to this quote that I pulled out of an article written by the Harvard professor Ravi Abdullah. And he says that what societies want depend on what they think they are. And I think that's something that you have been talking about. And so if we talk about, let's say, Ukraine, how would you distinguish the features of what people in Ukraine want across the spectrum? I'm sure different people want different things, but then how is the Ukrainian national character, let's say, different than a Russian national character, for, just in a broad layman term?
Well, it's an interesting question because, of course, it's very difficult to generalize. These are enormous countries, Russia, over 100 million, Ukraine, 40-something million people. But if you just look at the political landscape in Ukraine with the recent election in March this year, you could see there was one overtly pro-Russian candidate in the top 5, who, for reunification with Russia, essentially, he got 11% of the vote. So you have, let's say, a small sliver of Ukraine in the east, which is populated by Russian speakers and even ethnic Russians, who are fed a steady diet of Russian state TV, and I would say propaganda. Actually, it's funded by the Kremlin. They honestly believe that peace and stability is more important than, let's say, this dream of a free democratic country. Now, let's say also that this is understandable to me, actually, surprisingly, because the Ukrainian government, since Maidan, since the revolution, which in 2014,
2014.
yeah, was basically when the people rose up to be part of Europe. This was about the trade agreement with the European Union. That's what set it off. Unfortunately, the government that came to power after that, the pro-European government, the pro-Western government, disappointed a lot of people, and it disappointed me as well, because they would say all the right things about we want Ukraine to be integrated with the EU and NATO, but they did absolutely nothing in terms of reform to make that happen. There must be this understanding that in order to be part of Europe, you must kind of undergo this difficult growing process to establish the institutions and uphold the institutions like rule of law are necessary to having a functional democracy. Now, since this failed, essentially, it's a long story, but this failed in the last 5 years, hence the landslide presidential election getting rid of the incumbent last March. Because of this failure, the Russian, let's say the pro-Russian minority in Ukraine is a bit empowered by this, seeing, look, democracy and European aspirations, it's not working. But I think that's not the case. I think it was a matter of a lack of political will at the top. And I do think with the right leadership, which potentially we have right now, we'll see, I think we could move closer to that ideal. Now, as far as national character, I would say also I know many Russians in Ukraine who have left Putin's regime because they were against it. It's not safe for them in Russia. And they have in character as Ukrainians who want European integration, right? That's maybe not the majority of Russians, but it's just hard to generalize about national character. So.
Picking from what you said about how sort of the liberal agenda ended up disillusioning, probably make authorities, or did they get enough time to build those institutions, considering the fact that the history of Ukraine had been marred with these Soviet-type bureaucracies and so many entrenched political interests that would have definitely resisted any move towards reform.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the argument that the previous government always made. We need more time because we have this very difficult history to contend with, very weak and corrupted institutions across the government, and a huge government. Of course, as you mentioned rightly, the Soviet legacy was alive and well. There is also an oligarchy, essentially about 8 or 10 guys who control every industry in the country. Different industries, they compete with one another, but this is kind of the informal power structure. It's actually the least economically free country in Europe, I believe, according to Fraser Institute, which researches economic freedom of the world. So this can tell you a little bit about how Soviet legacy was never reformed. Now, that's not to say that reform must take time, because if you look at the example of Georgia, another former Soviet country, actually Georgia was the most corrupt Soviet country after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's a tiny country, a tenth the size of Ukraine, but they had at least as many criminal authorities, at least as many, let's say, unscrupulous businessmen controlling different industries. They had very high profile in terms of the Communist Party, in terms of the Soviet power structures. Even Stalin himself was Georgian. So they had this legacy as well, and a very difficult one. Now, Georgia reformed within about 3 years, 2003 to 2005-6.
Yeah, I know you wrote an article about that as well. I was reading that you had written that Georgia was able to turn the Russian Soviet-style bureaucracy upside down, and I was fascinated by it. So it'll probably be just useful to understand how were they able to do it in 3 years then.
Well, it goes back to the idea of political will, right? You had in Georgia, like in the entire region, in Russia as well, during the 1990s, total disaster, economic collapse after the fall of the Soviet Union and the privatization. You had no electricity in most of the country. It was a very desperate situation, and people were just ready for change. 2003, you had a rigged election, then Rose Revolution, peaceful revolution that brought Saakashvili, my boss, basically to power. And this was essentially not necessarily an endorsement of a new politician, but a rejection of the status quo, a rejection of the post-Soviet chaos where nothing worked, and what they call the dark 90s, because it was literally dark. Now, what that meant is the entire ruling elite, let's say, I don't know, they had to respond to the people, because the people were just completely fed up. The situation was so bad that you had the entire country in the streets. Now, what that means is you had ruling elite who wanted to keep their places in power. They fled to Russia or to countries. And then you had those elites who wanted to cooperate with the new government, and potentially some of them wanted to influence Saakashvili. It didn't work out as well as they thought. But altogether, the bottom line is the entire elite in Georgia cooperated, whether it's the political, business, media. They were all cooperating in order to get rid of corruption, first of all. Bribery, like low-level corruption especially, was a huge problem there. And to make a change. Now, what is also worthwhile is contrasting this with Ukraine, because in Ukraine, the fight against corruption is bureaucratized. You have a bunch of national anti-corruption agencies, different ones that don't necessarily work together. Sometimes they even compete. You have a special anti-corruption prosecutor who actually was filmed recently coaching suspects on how to avoid corruption charges. So these institutions, yeah, a lot of them are also funded by obviously the U.S. government and European government. Not that that's a problem. It's just that people do not look at it as their own sometimes. Like Ukrainians look at it as, okay, the U.S. is telling us we shouldn't be corrupt. They don't look at it as this is something that we must do for our country. Now, of course, USAID helped fund Saakashvili's reforms in Georgia as well, but it was a unified effort. It wasn't a bunch of different agencies. It was that the entire, every government structure is working together to adhere to certain principles, like you do not take bribes. If you're a criminal, you get prosecuted. And this was just expected. So, for example, to make it concrete, patrol police, the traffic police in Georgia, were notorious for taking bribes. Francis Fukuyama visited Georgia in 1990s, and he said he was stopped 13 times on a bribe for bribes. And so when Saakashvili came to power in just 2 years after he entered office in 2005, he fired the entire patrol police, about 50,000 people, I think. And rehired about half of them who had never been accused of taking bribes. And then to fill out the rest of the force, he raised the salary, by the way, for patrol police, and he had a meritocratic process. So you would have people who were from villages who didn't know anyone, who couldn't have gotten that kind of job before, but who took the test and they made it in. And so then you had one of the least corrupt police forces in the entire world. And this
basically he built it out from the scratch.
From scratch. And this was not politically popular. So there's a reason Saakashvili lost the election, in 2012, because to put it bluntly, he frustrated a lot of people. He angered a lot of people. He pissed a lot of people off, basically, because, people who had benefited from the old corrupt system and their families.
They won't like it.
Yeah, of course. So you always pay the price for this kind of rapid overnight reform. It's never comfortable for everyone. And that's the situation in Ukraine. That's what we're contending with right now. There are too many vested interests. It's a much bigger country than Georgia, many more vested interests, and it might even be a higher priority for Russia than Georgia was to keep Ukraine, as Ukraine is, like I said, larger and very strategic. As I forget who said this, it might have been Kissinger. Russia with Ukraine is an empire, and Russia without Ukraine is nothing. So.
That's an interesting take on it. So, which means, and that's something that comes up in the media as well, that Russia really has this identity issue that it's probably tackling with, and a big part of that identity issue is its relationship with the Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because without that, it is never going to regain its former glory.
Hmm.
But but
Absolutely.
but do you think eventually it is all like what I'm hearing is that it is all boiling down to whether the nationalists and the elite are cooperating or competing with each other? And that's, something that Ravi Abdullah also says, in the papers that I read from him, that in Ukraine there was a deadlock between the nationalists and the elites, and that was the reason why things didn't move forward, which makes me think that what do you think will it take for Ukraine to, kind of escape this buffer state status where, United States intervening, you've got Russia intervening from the other side, but then where is the policy autonomy and how do you think it's kind of, stuck in a Nash equilibrium? How do you think that can break?
To me, that's the heart of the issue, right? Because I think the EU and US are basically well-intentioned when it comes to Ukraine, but the best of intentions can still have negative consequences. And in my opinion, one of those negative consequences has been in that region learned helplessness. Ukrainians, Georgians, many Eastern Europeans, honestly, this is not everyone, but a lot of people believe that all decisions about their country's future are made in Washington or in Moscow. And they pay an outsized attention to what is being said in Washington about their country. If you see in Washington, some of the biggest lobbies belong to Ukrainian politicians and oligarchs because they just think that every decision is made here. And this is bad because, like I said earlier, people, in order to build a modern European state or a functioning state at all, must take ownership of their own future and their own country, right?
Correct.
They can't wait for whatever next decision will be made by Moscow or Washington. Now, of course, because of Ukraine's geography, it's impossible to escape the let's say the bear to the east, but that and of course I support then because I believe Ukraine should defend its territorial integrity. I support the U.S. in terms of the security assistance that we provide to Ukraine. But as far as internal politics,
Yeah.
I believe that should be like any reforms ought to be led by Ukrainians and not by Americans because we could support them. But I do not think we should be taking this top-down position of authority, telling a country essentially how to reform when most Americans do not have personal experience with the conditions in that country. And yeah, I think
But
one thing.
but Christina, this is what you're talking about, how it should happen. And we know that in real politics, the US or the Russia are not incentivized. They are not incentivized to, take off their foot from the Ukrainian pressure paddles. So, what do you think would enable Ukraine to, kind of assert its autonomy, if at all?
Well, I don't know about the incentives question is an interesting one because in my opinion as an American, I think there is a good reason for us to have Ukraine as a strong ally and trading partner, not as a charity case, right?
Hmm.
Now
Hmm.
we spent about I think 13 or 14 billion dollars since 2014 that have been essentially flushed down the toilet in terms of the progress that has been made on reforms in Ukraine. And this is including both IMF loans and direct assistance from Congress. Now, um, this is why I think there is an incentive. Look, we could save money. We could also have a real strong ally in a critical part of the world if we were willing to take a step back and
Uh-huh.
empower local Ukrainians to like for example with this new government they are reformist.
Hmm.
We do not need to tell them exactly who they should pick in terms of administration personnel in terms of the cabinet. We don't need to micromanage them.
Right.
um, do need to offer help where needed. And I think, so I think, yes, there is an incentive, let's say, for us to see Ukraine as a functioning country. I don't think the establishment often sees that because too many people, unfortunately, in policy making positions do benefit from Ukraine being a basket case in some ways, but
Right.
that's another conversation, and it's not only Ukraine. Now, what needs to be done? Rule of law needs to be established. There cannot be impunity anymore for whether it's former officials or oligarchs in particular. That's easier said than done because oligarchs still have a strong grip on power structures in Ukraine. The way to help, though, is if these people are have credible evidence against them that they've committed crimes, and many of them have investments in real estate in the U.S., we can freeze their assets. That's probably the best thing that we can do within our power in order to weaken their position in Ukraine. So this is how I look at it.
And at the same time, there needs to be some containment strategy so that the vacuum is not filled by Russia.
Of course.
If the US is, taking, so to say, a step back.
Of course. Well, I think that containment is already, it's been demonstrated already by the Ukrainian people. We saw what happened going back to 2014. They did have a Russian puppet government essentially for years before. And this was unfortunately assisted by Paul Manafort, an American, in power. Now, how did that collapse? It was not a CIA coup.
Okay.
There's the U.S. supported Maidan, but that started with Ukrainian people. That started with actually a couple of journalists who called people out onto the square, and then as soon as the police escalated by killing a peaceful protester, it really the entire situation really got kind of out of control. But look, it accomplished with all this tragedy, it accomplished the intended goal, which was to get rid of this Russian puppet state, this oppressive government that was obviously by Russia. So this is the control valve kind of. And like I said, the 11% of the population voted for the overtly pro-Russian candidate last election. All the other candidates at least said that they're pro-EU and pro-NATO, and that's part of their platform. How committed they are to it is another question, but that's what people voted for.
Right. So, which brings two questions to my mind. The first one is that what you said about the whole 2014 movement starting from the people and aided by the US. That was also kind of the narrative of Russia and the Eastern Ukrainian occupation. That it was Luhansk and all of these groups were basically aspirations of the people living over there, and Russia essentially just aided them, so to say.
Well, I'm sure there were some people who were interested in being part of Russia, but we need to look at Russia's pattern throughout since post-Soviet times to understand what happened there. Look at Georgia, for example, 2008. You remember the conflict between Russia and Georgia, actually Russia's invasion of Georgia. Now, how Russia justified a conventional invasion, by the way, unlike in Ukraine, was that apparently they wanted to keep the peace because local people in South Ossetia, in this breakaway region of Georgia, were being oppressed by the Georgian government, and they were rising up for their freedom. Now, what actually was going on was you had a Russian irregular battalion, one called Vostok Battalion, who would go, they're not, you wouldn't identify them as Russian soldiers, but they are irregulars, right? So they would go cause total chaos in these villages. Georgian government will respond by sending in special police to put down these uprisings. And then Russia gets footage of Georgian police coming into these villages. And then they say, look, we need to keep the peace. Now they had provoked it though. It just was a hybrid kind of provocation. But this is actually General Mattis had a very good interview about this where he talked exactly about how Russia provoked this unrest in Georgia and used it as a pretext for invasion. So there is a pattern here. Now also, when it comes to local volunteer uprisings, you have to think what are the characteristics of separatists, actual separatists versus Russian soldiers. So remember MH17? This passenger jet from, I believe, Netherlands, flying this conflict region of Ukraine that was shot down.
Yes.
And that was July 2014 when Russia completely denied any involvement in this conflict and said it's just separatists. Now, how are separatists using anti-aircraft weapons like this? Where did they get it from? Well, they got it from Russia, and they sent it back to Russia afterwards. So, like, you don't have ordinary volunteers from Eastern Ukraine with their own little battalions
gunning down aircraft. Yeah.
Yeah, they are not only trained by Russia. I mean, they are Russian soldiers essentially, and they had a weapon directly from Russia. That's not small arms that you would find in, actual separatist conflict. That was one dead giveaway. It was like, if you remember 1992, 1993, the conflict in Abkhazia. Russia again insisted these are separatists in the North Caucasus. They are fighting for independence from Georgia. Well, Georgian soldiers at that time shot down a Russian plane in 1993. And how did the separatists get a Russian plane? I mean, they couldn't. It was, of course, there was Russian involvement, but this has always been Russia's pattern since the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin has intensified it, but yes, plausible deniability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is also a favorite tactic of Pakistan when it's dealing with India, because, when you look at the Kargil War over here, that's how it started. That initially, it took, the world some time to realize that it's not the terrorists who are occupying that territory in Kashmir. It's actually the Pakistani soldiers. So, yeah, I think it's like a right out of the book tactic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't actually studied Pakistan and India much, but it makes sense that this would not be unique to Russia. It is just a pattern. Essentially, the disappointing thing, which I'm sure you can relate to, is when the rest of the world falls for it, and they say, look, we don't have proof that Russia's doing anything there. It could be separatists, but they want to give the benefit of the doubt to Putin for some reason, whereas I don't think he's done anything to earn that. But now I think it's changed since MH17, actually. So
let's talk about the economy. Like how, like I know that in the 90s, Ukraine especially, it was the total dependence on Russia was 82% in terms of its economy. How has that changed, and how has that changed for Ukraine, for Georgia, and generally the other Eastern European countries? And how much do you think that plays out a role in the degree of integration or disintegration with Russia, the EU, etc., etc.?
Well, again, got to remember that proximity is maybe the most important factor for trade and investment. Sharing a border, the border effect. Now, this is still strong in Ukraine and to a lesser extent, Georgia. In Georgia, because of the war, there was an embargo. Now, and in Saakashvili's time, 2004 to 2012, Georgia prioritized energy independence from Russia, meaning
that must have been hard.
Very hard, but necessary, because if you're dependent on Russia for energy, Russia can cut off natural gas, for example, in the middle of winter, and this is what they've done before in these countries. And so this was, and Poland, by the way, did achieve energy independence from Russia. So they were kind of looking there as an example. Now, unfortunately, since 2012, there has been a bit of backsliding in Georgia. The current leader of the country, who holds no official position, he's just an oligarch, but he's the ruling party chairman and financier. He is a shareholder of Russian state gas company, Gazprom. So he obviously has little incentive to achieve energy independence. Now, Ukraine also prioritized, since Maidan, energy independence. They have made a little bit of progress, but still these countries are quite, I mean, I wouldn't say dependent on Russia completely, but most foreign investment and cross-border, trade flows in general come. I mean, in Ukraine, trade with Russia still is larger than trade with the EU, despite the free trade agreement being signed with the EU. There is a way out of this, but essentially it's not necessarily through trade agreements or bureaucratic means. It's through internal reforms that change Ukraine's economy. What I mean by that is, again, rule of law, so that foreign investors from the rest of the world, not Russia, feel comfortable investing there. Accountability in the court system, and independence of the court system, most importantly. And of course, like I said, least economically free country in Europe. That means there is so much red tape if you want to invest or if you want to start a business there.
Yeah.
That red tape can be cut. And actually, the new president, Zelensky,
Mhm.
his team, one of his top advisors, used to be in charge of a libertarian think tank and has a lot of great ideas for these sorts of streamlining government reforms to
Right.
encourage foreign investment and to encourage local people to start their own businesses. So
Right.
this is one way to decrease dependence on Russia, right? Another way is prioritizing education, right? Human capital,
Mhm.
because one country I would point to as a good example for Georgia's development, at least, is Ireland. Small country, kind of history of being occupied by a more powerful country,
Right.
um, and no natural resources really, but became an economic powerhouse because of educating people. You have an English-speaking population, so you have a lot of outsourcing there, top
Yeah.
IT companies.
Technically trained now. Yeah.
And Ukraine and Georgia could follow that lead. All you need to do is have, I mean, not it's not simple, but lower taxes, better climate for investment, and teach kids English in school,
Mhm.
um, so that you will become a more attractive place for international companies to put maybe a regional office, like
Yeah.
they have, or even headquarters. So this is how I see the the natural resources is not the way that these countries are ever going to be independent from Russia. It
Right.
is human capital. That's it. And better invest, because Russia does not have a good investment climate either. There's no rule of law essentially. So this is one way that
It's
Ukraine,
essentially who knows who over there, right?
exactly, and Ukraine, it's like that too, but they can change and they can differentiate themselves. And I think in this new government, there is a will to do so. At least they've been talking about it, which is at first.
Hmm.
I mean, and the people who have been appointed so far into key positions do have the right ideas. I mean, they know what needs to be done. Now the question is whether they're going to do it. Well,
Right.
it's
Yeah,
early.
and I mean, I did this. So I was teaching at the San Francisco State University, and in this particular course, we were, talking about public participation in local governance and things like that. And one of the case studies was talking about the experiments of public participation that have taken place in Eastern European countries. And the reason why they have not been so successful is because on the ground, people think that whoever is the political elite, whoever is the mayor, his or her connections are eventually going to bring resources to the local economy, and they do not feel that they have the right information, the right sort of power, the right sort of economic resources to actually become self-sufficient in political and economic ways both.
That's correct because again, this is the question of education too, because they have this mental model post-Soviet countries that the government should provide for them and that they must basically submit to the government and they will expect to be taken care of. This mental model can be broken, by the way. It's not a psychological defect within these nations because we saw in other countries how it has been broken. Like I said, the Baltic states,
Yeah.
Poland,
Mhm.
they have moved beyond this. Now, unfortunately, the post-Soviet elites have
Right.
an incentive to keep people poorly educated and to keep people poor, so
Right.
that when people are physically hungry and you're bribing them with food to vote for you, they
Yeah.
will. This
Yeah.
happens, unfortunately, in these
Absolutely.
countries. But the key, I mean, key is first of all, people themselves need to understand, yes, I might sell my vote now, but it's not only about getting a meal. It's I'm selling my future, my kids' future, my country's future. And in Georgia, they're coming to that realization, I think. Ukraine, they have already reached that realization with Maidan, as we've seen.
Right.
Um, the question is whether they can get the right people know what they want and what they need to do. They need to get the right leaders in. And I think, like I said, I have great optimism finally with this new government because they are talking about not identity politics like previous government,
Hmm.
not talking about not they're not necessarily like nationalist or shallow nationalist like I would call Poroshenko's government.
Yeah.
They're talking about the real problems that Ukraine faces, which I think at the heart is economic. And like I said, if you can have real economic growth, like Poland has had,
Right.
by establishing rule of law, by rooting out corruption, and by creating a better climate for investors, and for entrepreneurs, then independence from Russia will flow from that, I think. Then you're in a stronger position to negotiate. Um, you're no longer completely dependent on your neighbor. So this is how I see it. The heart is economic, and with more economic freedom, there's a lot of room to grow there. You will see growth. There is enormous potential.
So, you know, this is the last question that comes to my mind is that when I look at the world, I see that the liberal story is fading away. And, I was also reading this book by Yuval Harari, and he is also talking about the fact that, in the 20th century, there were three stories which were told to the world. One was the Nazi story, one was the communist story, and one was the liberal story. And the Nazi story faded away, it dropped out, they lost out. Then the communist story and the liberal story were competing, and the communist story lost out as well. And now we are slowly entering a post ideological world where the liberal story is also fading out. You already see that in the United States, which is like the crown prince of liberalism.
Yeah.
Uh, and you see all of these nations closing up and trade wars shaping, and I think that there are mid-century crises. That is, that's also another historical theory that every mid-century the systems break down and there's a new one that comes up. And we are probably seeing China, increasingly setting the rules of the game and trade wars shaping up. So where do you think that with this loss of the liberal story, what story do nations like Ukraine have then to build on to? What mental models will they have to build on to?
Well, first of all, I challenge the premise just a little bit in that, this end of history theory, Fukuyama again, this was popular because it's very appealing. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds to say that we won the Cold War, for example, because the Soviet Union collapsed, but in reality, we did not.
Right.
Right now, I would say US-Russian relations are worse than during the Cold War for most of it, and Russia still has the same imperial ambitions without the communist ideology, but
Mm-hmm.
same communism was a form of imperialism for Russia, and now it's just in a different iteration. It's more nationalism. So I don't think it's fair to say that liberalism triumphed in the
Mm-hmm.
end, because liberalism triumphed. It would have triumphed in Russia as well, because people would have seen that, look, it's preferable to embrace democracy and to embrace free trade and human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they didn't. People seek stability in the end, and that's, I think, what we see with this minority of pro-Russian Ukrainians. They
Mm-hmm.
believe they can have peace and stability, or like in a country like Belarus, let's say, Europe's last
Yeah.
dictatorship is what they call it. I've been there. It's actually a very pleasant country, but yes, no freedom, no human rights. But the interesting thing is, if you talk to the average person there, most of them will say that they're happy the way that their country is. They don't want chaos like in Ukraine. They don't
Right.
want poverty and homelessness like they hear happens in the US. They don't want inequality.
Right.
So I think this it's questionable whether liberalism as an idea
Mm-hmm.
triumphed among the elites of the world, let's say, but that doesn't mean it triumphed among people of the world. And yeah, like you said, we can see it in America these days too. People are looking inward increasingly, and I think this is what's going to define the future of Eastern Europe. That these countries, they must look inward for the solutions to their problems, not to Russia, not to the United States, and not to the EU. That's not to say they shouldn't seek alliances or seek to strengthen relations with the EU and US. Of course, they should. I believe that's one of the keys to their successful development and economic development, especially. But in the end, they must realize the solution is with them. It's not going to be imposed externally. It has to come from the bottom up,
Right.
which I think it's so important to invest in education, human
Right.
capital.
Right. No, that's why I'm a big fan of the non-aligned movement that Nehru started, and India was kind of leading it for the world at that point of time. And that was, partly the reason why. India, which was a fledgling economy at that point of time, survived to become a stronger economy later on. Because, you don't want to be part of that game where you know that you're not strong enough to take your own stand.
Yes, and that's impressive actually, because India, of course, was most famously had this colonial experience
Yeah.
and could have had the same learned helplessness that we see in other post-colonial countries today, but did not. And so I think it could serve as a great example actually for
Mhm.
countries like Ukraine. So
Yeah, and one of the things that you said, and I think that's really profound, is that in the end, people want some sort of stability, even more than probably prosperity.
yep.
People do want some stability, and I think that's something to keep in mind, and that's probably also for good or bad the reason why a lot of authoritarian regimes survive, because they give them just the right dose of stability.
Right. And also in these authoritarian regimes, at least in Eastern Europe and Belarus, you don't see the same inequality. Of course, it exists, but it's not obvious as it is in Ukraine. So
All right.
people may be poor, but they're not living in the streets, and they do not see
They don't
their
see
neighbors
it.
driving around in luxury cars or living very lavishly like you would see in Russia or Ukraine. So there is more stability in a society like this. I'm not advocating for it though, because of course it's a dictatorship,
Sure.
but this is why it appeals to a lot of people, and I can understand that. So,
No, certainly. And, I also see a lot of upheavals going on in the United States because, you take a walk in downtown San Francisco and you can see stark inequality right in front of your eyes.
oh,
So,
that's probably the biggest example in the world, one of the biggest, or where I'm from, Los Angeles. It's a
mhm.
very situation, and it's sad because this also shows, look, our system, we pretend our system is perfect, and when we're going around the world working in international development,
Yeah,
we uphold ourselves as the ideal, and I understand why in some ways, but in other ways, we have to also be honest with ourselves that nobody has the ideal, and we certainly do not either.
figuring
So,
things out.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So thank
Well,
you so much for having me on. It's been
thank you
really,
so much, Christina. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that we'll be able to have you again on this podcast sometime and know more about your work and Eastern Europe in general.
anytime. I'm always happy to talk about Eastern Europe. As you can tell, I have a lot to say. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
Well, this was
So
really helpful. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
have a good day.
You
Bye.
too.